Hello.
Hi.
How should we proceed here? You guys want to introduce yourselves and tell us what's up with Dr. Biden? No, he's not the doctor. The other guy, President Biden.
Sure. Are we recording?
Yeah, we
Okay.
are. But I'll cut
Okay.
in when it gets appropriate or inappropriate, as the case may be.
Okay, great. Sure. Happy to. My name is Kara Dansky, and I serve on the steering committee of the Women's Human Rights Campaign's U.S. chapter. And I'm also chairing the Committee on Law and Legislation for the International Women's Human Rights Campaign. And we should say that anyone who's interested can find us at womensdeclaration.com. It pretty much sets out our radical feminist arguments as to why the law should protect women and girls as women and girls on the basis of sex. And I'd be happy to talk about President Biden's order. Amy, do you want to say something?
Yeah, I'm a former theater educator. That's my background. And I got into this really mainly because of Kara, you and the conversation you had with Courtney Piper. I saw you at the Seattle event. I've been in this conversation for a few years now, trying to protect the legal rights of women and girls for our sex-based protections to spaces and sports. And Courtney brought this to my attention and said, let's do an event around this. I think that was the conversation that you two had, and I was ready to jump on board.
Yeah. And Benjamin, you were at the Seattle event that Amy is referring to. I think she's referring to the event that happened in February of 2020 called Fighting the New Misogyny, put on by the Women's Liberation Front. And yeah, the idea of having an event in DC came from a phone call that I was having with Courtney, in which I was just really lamenting the potential impact of the enforcement of Biden's order in the United States. And I just was thinking, this is the same stuff that women have been dealing with for centuries. And I just kind of felt inspired, and I was just thinking out loud, and I just said, why don't we picket the White House? Let's do this. You know, we're dealing with the same kind of woman hatred that the suffragettes and suffragists were dealing with a century ago. Let's do what they did. Let's follow their inspiration. Let's take this on.
Yeah, I made a comment flippantly about after that EO came through for on Biden's first 2 hours or 90 minutes, he signed that thing, and I'm like, well, Trump was painted, and I don't want to argue whether or not how misogynist he was, but after he got elected, there was just people flooded the streets in fancy hats and picketed for the rights of women. And then Biden gets in and he essentially makes an executive order that, if not erases women, then definitely erodes the categories of sex upon which women's rights are based. So whereas Trump grabbed them by one thing, Biden grabbed them by another. That was my facetious comment. And then we all got hooked up to talk about this. And I think we should dive into what specifically about the EO is troubling or worrisome.
Sure. So we should take a step back and just clarify the EO itself does not actually amend existing law. There's nothing in the EO that changes the law as it is written today. Instead, it essentially does two things. The first thing it does is that it sets out an administrative policy that wherever sex is included in the law, that federal agencies are hereby required to define that to include gender identity. So that's the basic policy. And it based its policy on last summer's Supreme Court decision in the Bostock case, which probably your listeners are familiar with, but let me know if you wanted me to get into any detail about
Could
that.
you give a brief brief on that brief?
Sure. So in the Bostock case, there were basically three cases that the Supreme Court combined. In two of those cases, the plaintiffs were gay men who were able to demonstrate that they were fired on the basis of being gay. And they sued their employer under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. The third case was brought by a man named Amy Stevens, who sued his employer, which was a funeral home, arguing that he was fired because of his quote unquote transgender status. Excuse me. A lot of people are a little bit confused about that case because it seems to be the assumption or the mistaken belief that Bostock ruled that sex-specific dress codes violate the law. It did not rule that, and Amy Stevens was not arguing that. Amy Stevens sued demanding legal and employment recognition to be considered a woman, and he eventually won with the Supreme Court's ruling that he was discriminated against on the basis of transgender status, which is, the Supreme Court said, a form of sex discrimination. And we should just note that the Supreme Court didn't take the trouble to tell us what transgender status might mean.
Oh, geez.
Yeah, so we're sort of stuck with that decision. And I should say, I think most of us, I certainly would agree that it should absolutely be illegal to fire someone on the basis of sexual orientation, which the other two cases were about. And those cases were decided rightly. It's just troubling that Amy Stevens won his case based on discrimination on the basis of transgender status as a form, the Supreme Court said, of sex discrimination. So that's the case from last summer. The EO then derives its policy on that decision, from that decision, but it does so in very misleading ways. And one of the things that it does is say that under the reasoning of Bostock, that so-called transgender status should be protected throughout administrative law. But that's not what the Supreme Court said. And in fact, as bad as the Supreme Court's decision last summer was, it did specify that its ruling was limited to the Title VII or employment context. And one of the things that this order does is spread it throughout all aspects of United States administrative law.
Mm-hmm. I said "oh geez" earlier because I'm wary of any sort of conversation that doesn't define its terms, but even more so when law doesn't define its terms. And if we have these terms such as transgender status, what does that mean? And gender identity. So is gender identity defined in the EO or within the law? Do we know what they're talking about when they talk about that?
When gender identity is defined in the law, throughout the law, it is typically done in either meaningless or completely circular ways. I do not believe, thinking right now, that the EO defines gender identity, and it just says that discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity should be considered a form of sex discrimination, again, based on the Supreme Court's reasoning in Bostock. But you're absolutely right. The Supreme Court didn't tell us what the phrase transgender status means. And so we can't know legally. We just don't know what they had in mind when they issued their ruling last summer.
Is there a way for it to be defined? What would it take for the law to define it? Does it need to go through another court case that eventually bumps it all the way up to the Supreme Court just to define that term? Can we hold anybody accountable for that question mark?
It could. And there are currently a couple of cases that are percolating through the federal courts, which may make it back up to the Supreme Court. Alternatively, Congress could act here. And the Women's Human Rights Campaign U.S. chapter has put forth a proposal called the Equality for All Act, which explains exactly what sex discrimination means. And it would protect women and girls from discrimination on the basis of sex. It would protect gay, lesbian, and bisexual people on the basis of sexual orientation. And it would protect everybody who doesn't conform to sex-based stereotypes.
Okay.
We would really like to see that introduced in Congress this session.
So why then is it a big deal? What are the outpouring or the consequences of gender identity being installed in law as something that has a consequence to violate or to discriminate against? Why do you guys have a problem with that?
Yeah, I think sometimes this can be understood to be a little bit abstract. I think that's a great question because, why do we care if there's this weird concept of gender identity out there and no one's defined it and no one really knows what it means? That's not great, as you said, but why do we care? And the reason that we care is that we're talking about very real consequences for women and girls. We're talking about men in women's prisons on the basis of their gender identity. We're talking about boys and men in women's intimate spaces, naked, with penises, locker rooms, changing rooms, bathrooms, on the basis of their so-called gender identity. And I should also say that even men who claim to be transgender, who do not have their penises, we still don't want them in our spaces. We could talk about that. But defining the word sex to mean gender identity has the impact of obliterating women in the law as a protected category and the effect of allowing men into our sports, as I said, our intimate spaces. It allows men to claim sports are a really important one, in part just because that's a very important area that we could explore. But also, I think a lot of times people don't understand the value of sports to women and girls cannot be understated, because it's not just the ability to compete with and against other women and girls, which is very important. It's also the ability to be recruited by college coaches, to compete for scholarships, and to really get ahead. And so the implications of this are really far-reaching.
Especially to people who can't just afford to go to college on their own, specifically with scholarships and stuff. This really impacts lower class women or lower middle class women.
Well, and the other two things, it also is one, just about our ability to name material reality accurately, for women and girls in the workplace to, be able to say that is a man if that's a man, and I am a woman if they're a woman, and not be reduced to some identity status, but be able to be recognized as whole human beings and who can accurately use our senses and name men as men and boys as boys, and not be penalized or attacked or even prosecuted for that. And then I think, Kara, as well, it's our right to be able to decide on our healthcare provider and who touches us in medical settings. So to say, I want a woman doctor, and when that woman doctor comes, for her to be an adult human female. And not a man who is saying that his identity status is woman identity, whatever that is.
Yeah. I'm not going to make a cat pun right now, but I need to let the cat out of the room. I'll be right back. What were you going to say, Kara?
I just agree completely with what Amy said. It's really important for women, especially when we're dealing with matters of pregnancy and childbirth and surviving a sexual assault or a rape. It's really important for women to be able to have and to get health care that's provided by female physicians. And the thing that really gets me about this is that people understand that. The things that we're saying really ought not be controversial. There was a situation a couple of weeks ago in Scotland where the Parliament was amending one of its healthcare laws. And what it intended to do was give women who were getting sexual assault examinations the ability to demand to specify the sex of their provider. But it didn't do that. Instead, it used the word gender. And there was a female parliamentarian who stood up and said, wait a second, this isn't right. We need to give sexual assault survivors the ability to choose the sex of their provider. So she raised that, and it caused such an uproar. It's caused such a controversy, and it really shouldn't. It really should not be as controversial as it is to say that female sexual assault survivors ought to be able to have women doctors, or that women who are having medical problems related to a pregnancy ought to be able to see female physicians. These should not be controversial things, but in today's society, they are.
Let's pretend that somebody just took a nap for 10 years and woke up. And could you guys explain why there was an uproar about a woman parliamentarian demanding that somebody could choose the sex of whoever's tending to them? Why was there an uproar for somebody who hasn't been paying attention to the escalation of this?
Amy, do you want to?
Sure. Yeah. This, what's been going on little by little, in a very in a very targeted, basically marketing campaign by the gender industry, is that linguistically we've been slowly changing the word sex into the word gender, meaning gender identity. So people who claim a gendered identity are claiming that they, quote unquote, are women. We've heard organizations like Mermaids using a born in the wrong body campaigning, meaning that people are literally born in the wrong body and they were only assigned a sex, but their true sort of inner soul is a different sex than their body, which is ridiculous because we are fully embodied human beings. And not only is sex change impossible for humans, it's impossible for all mammals. And, whatever, as I have continued to say, whatever is or isn't happening in a man who is dysphoric's brain, it is totally unrelated to the experience of existing in a female body.
And why is there so much pressure to treat, for society to conform around the whims of one's declared gender identity? Do you guys kind of understand why?
So this was a very deliberate strategy, and it's a very deliberate strategy that has a lot of money behind it. One thing I will say is that, as we discussed or have discussed previously, on one level, this is just pure misogyny. Like, it is just pure misogyny. It's no different from the old misogyny. But we also have to understand that this is part of a movement to completely separate identity from material reality. And there is a tremendous amount of money behind it. And the 11th Hour blog has done an extraordinary job of documenting the money behind this. This is being driven by the medical establishment. It's being driven by pharma. Who profits off this? Who profits off of putting thousands of people onto lifelong hormones and life-altering surgeries? It's not a mystery. So there's a tremendous amount of money that is driving this movement, which transgender is part of a larger movement to separate identity from material reality. And the other thing that we know is that this was done by stealth. We have seen evidence that they're very clear in what they're doing. They're very clear in sort of inserting gender identity into the law sort of quietly under the radar without making a big deal out of it. And they've done this. They've succeeded. So the term gender identity appears in the Violence Against Women Act. It appears throughout all sorts of areas of U.S. law. It's not as though they came in with a hammer until now and said, okay, we're going to change all law to define sex to include gender identity. Biden has now done that.
Mm-hmm. So if you can convince people...
Should say, I'm sorry, Benjamin. I need to clarify. Biden's order has done that with respect to administrative law. It doesn't affect the statute, which is done by Congress. I just wanted to make that clear.
Okay. But okay. It could get... but this is one maneuver that will be followed through with other maneuvers. So our entire government. I've seen gender ideology inserted into schools through trainings and through anti-bullying tactics. I watch it being placed and assigned to us as the good thing to do, to change our version of reality around the one person who wants to declare that their reality is different, or their feeling of reality is different than ours.
Yeah, it's couched in anti-bullying campaigns in schools. It is consistently couched in quote unquote diversity and inclusion. So this has been done by stealth for the last several years. So that the question that one would ask after taking a nap for 10 years would be a very good one. What on earth happened? And those are some of the kinds of things that have happened.
Mm-hmm. Well, and it's, that term inclusivity is one of the sort of sloganeering phrases that they throw around all the time. It sounds really progressive and you're meant to not really question it. But the fact of the matter is that we live in a material universe. Everything is bounded. Boundaries are part of this. Exclusivity is part of not only being a human being, but it's part of the material universe. Everything that exists, including, the electrons of an atom, is bounded. Boundaries are part of this. And ultimately what is happening is this is a boundary violating movement. This is, the sloganeering phrases this under the terminology of trans rights or human rights. But in fact, men and women have human rights. The only rights that people under this gendered category don't have are the existing sex-based rights of women and girls. And this is exactly what we see in the EO. This is what they're now coming after. There are no human rights that they lack. They can marry anyone they want. Anyone who's non-conforming can hold a job. If you're goth or into cosplay or have any other kind of body modification, you have a right to health care and employment. The phrasing that it's about trans rights is very disingenuous. It is an attack on women's rights. It's a boundary violating movement.
I've taken several pot shots or attempts at trying to make a case for me about why the sexes should be separated, specifically in locker rooms and bathrooms. And I don't think I've got it right yet. So what are your two's arguments for keeping the sexes away from each other during bodily functions and dressing?
I think it's the right of consent. Women and girls deserve the right of consent. They have the right of bodily integrity and boundaries around their body and the right of privacy. I think there's a lot of arguments that could be made about, male violence statistics versus women's violence statistics, and women are at greater risk to male violence. But I think that's sort of a superfluous argument. I mean, I think the argument that women and girls deserve consent over who comes in their space is enough. We shouldn't have to prove that, we are raped at such and such a rate as opposed to male rape. I mean, I think it's enough to say that consent is, we deserve consent.
Yeah, the question comes up. I know you asked about locker rooms and bathrooms. The question comes up often in sports. And typically when we talk about this issue in the sports context, the argument that is often made is that male athletes retain physical advantages over female athletes, even after going on hormones. And that is absolutely true. But I do just want to add, even if it weren't true, women have the right to say no to men in our spaces at any time for any reason or no reason at all, whether we're talking about the bedroom, the bathroom, or a playing field. For me, that's what it comes down to. In some ways, that's a different way of saying what Amy said about consent. But I don't feel like we should, we do have to articulate arguments as to why it's inappropriate to have men in women's locker rooms, unfortunately, but we really ought not have to.
So I ask that because it seems to be pegged upon, it seems like one of the weakest links is that we are acculturated to separate the sexes during certain activities. It's a part of our culture. It's a part of a mores that we've formed and that we've inherited, and we haven't necessarily consented to the culture that we were born in. It's something that we proceed with. So if the gender ideology proponents want to reshape culture to make it not an issue anymore, then it's we're really caught in a relativistic argument about which culture has dominance, and if they win the majority of culture, then they basically get to dictate what is consent and isn't consent. It's very smart of them to go into schools and make that a part of the young people's minds that it's okay. But will that necessarily lead to bad outcomes, devil's advocate style, for young men and women to grow up from childhood onward, sharing restrooms, sharing locker rooms? We see it in science fiction movies all the time. So
can I share a quick personal story? And I promise to make it quick on this.
No. We have no time constraints. This is not Tucker Carlson.
Okay. So here's a story, and I promise you that this is true. Okay, this is 100% true story of something that happened in my life. I was 13 years old. I was at an amusement park with my mother and my 13-year-old friend and her mother. And neither I nor my friend had yet started our period. And I was walking with my mom behind my friend and her mom. And I saw that all of a sudden her it was a hot summer day. She was wearing all white, and I saw that her shorts were just covered in blood. So I ran up to her and I told her what was going on. It was her first time. She was absolutely mortified. Now, Benjamin, I know that you cannot understand what it is like for a young teenage or pre-teenage girl to start her period. You just cannot understand that. But let me tell you, it's complicated. And having that experience is, it's emotionally and psychologically complicated. Having that experience while wearing white shorts out at an outdoor amusement park, being surrounded by total strangers. My friend was mortified. Okay, so we all gather around her and we all scurry to the women's room, which was a women's room. Nobody was violating that at the time. And we stand there at the sink, and my friend's mom tells her to take off her shorts, which she does. And my friend's mom is furiously scrubbing the shorts out in the sink while my friend stood there in her underwear, sobbing, just sobbing. And as a way of comforting her, my mom's friend said to her daughter, "Honey, it's okay. We're all women in here. We all know what you're going through." And that's the key phrase. We all know what you're going through. First of all, this story should, affect anybody who cares about the rights, privacy, and safety of women and girls. And women can appreciate just how horrible that experience must have been for my friend. But the phrase, "we're all women in here, we all know what you're going through," matters in the context of the conversations that we're having right now. Because I do not care how much surgery a man has to cut off his penis. I do not care how much hormones he takes to, change his voice or, his muscle mass or whatever. I don't care, because not a single male on the face of the planet had any idea or ever would have any idea what my friend was going through in that moment. And if we give up our sex segregated bathrooms, no mom is going to be able to say to her daughter, "Don't worry, honey, we're all women in here. We all know what you're going through."
Yeah, and the fact of the matter is we already have seen this policy being abused, and we have seen, people go back on it. Target introduced a gender neutral bathroom policy where you could choose the bathrooms according to your gender, and they eventually revoked that policy because it was being abused by men. Part of this progressive idealism is that there are only good agents. There are only people who are acting in earnest and, who truly believe this about themselves. But the fact of the matter is the language around this is so, it's so undefined. It's so unclear. We know that men will take advantage of self-ID. If all that you need to enter women's spaces is your own self-claim, there's just really no way to protect anyone from bad agents, and that is already happening. And the Ministry of Justice has kept reports on their prison records, and they have seen that in terms of the general male population prison, they have sex crime rates at around, I think it was 18%. And this can be looked up on the Ministry of Justice website. And then those men who have self-reported themselves as trans identity have sexual assault rates more in the 38-40%. So either self-ID is being taken advantage of, or they are more likely to assault sexually. Either way, it's worse for women, and either way, vulnerable women are being put in a bad place. And the fact of the matter is, they, again, that the ad campaign around this likes to claim that these are a vulnerable population. But the truth is that women and girls should not be made to be human shields for men who are vulnerable. There's lots of vulnerable men in male spaces. There's, gay men or young men or weak men or pretty men. If male spaces are unsafe for some men, we should absolutely address that and take that up with men. But it is not the responsibility of women and girls to become human shields for a population of men who is vulnerable.
That is a very good point. When they speak about a vulnerable population, they leave out vulnerable to whom, or from whom are they being assaulted? And if it is men, then work should be done focusing on men's acceptance rather than women's acceptance. Furthermore, just on a philosophical note, and this is something I've been thinking about a lot, just within the culture of inclusion and the culture of acceptance, once you start to erode all those boundaries, it comes down to assertion. It comes down to brute power. Whoever can assert reality, because we're no longer moored to reality in any sort of coincident sense where we can actually measure it. It's all consensus morality. It's all assertion then. And women in this instance are affected, but the entire framework of inclusivity gone wild, let's say, is really devolving us into, it's leaving us to do nothing but fight because we've lost these boundaries.
Yeah, and you were talking about the school curriculum, and I know that school curriculum that Mermaids put forth literally included the language of embrace your discomfort.
Yes.
So instead of kids actually being told, listen to your intuition, if something feels wrong, it's probably wrong, they're told to trust someone else's authority above their own and to embrace their discomfort. Now, that's an absolutely insane place to put kids in. That's the opposite of child safeguarding. Kids need to learn to trust their boundaries and to respect their own boundaries. And, if you tell them to respect someone else's narrative above their own and to respect someone else's senses above their own intuition and senses, that at best it's dangerous. At worst, it's literal child grooming.
Yeah. I was going to say, the grooming word was about to appear there, and you hit it right there. So what does this do, gender ideology or gender identity in this realm of what we're saying, what does this do with the ability for people to recognize, children to recognize sexual assault or sexual harassment, but assault or sexual molestation? And what does it do for our ability to communicate sexual assault, if not just sexuality and gender in general? Does that affect the law in any way that you've seen, Kara?
Does that affect the law? I don't.
With regards to how, like policing or anything like that, with how people can define when they're being violated sexually.
Oh, well, I can say for certain that I have looked at the internal policies of the police department where I live, and police officers are required to refer to perpetrators and victims using the perpetrators and victims so-called preferred pronouns. And to, it uses language like, if the perpetrator is male but identifies as female, treat the perpetrator as a female. But no one really knows exactly what that means.
What does that mean?
What does
My
that
lady,
look like in practice?
Would you please get in the police car? Like, what?
Right.
Is that?
Right. So
How do you?
So yes, and this is slightly off topic. So
Okay.
Steer me, rein me in if I'm a little bit too off topic here. But a real problem that people are really not talking about has to do with the reporting of crime statistics. And so I happen to know, because of my former profession before I got canceled out of it, I happen to know that the FBI maintains crime statistics. The FBI does not generate its own crime statistics. Rather, it keeps them when they are submitted by local police departments. We have tens of thousands of local police departments across this country, all of whom I assume have their own policies on this stuff. And so the question becomes, the crime statistics that the FBI displays on its website, it's table 42 of the Uniform Crime Report, in case anybody wants to get nerdy and look it up. It lists violent crime by sex, right? And the one column is male and one column is female, and it talks about, the different numbers and the percentages and all of that good stuff. So at least according to the FBI in 2021, the words male and female still mean something when it comes to maintaining crime statistics. However, what we do not know and have no way of knowing without undertaking an extremely heavy lift and amount of work is how local police departments report them. So if there is a man who commits a murder and then self-identifies as a woman, or even if he's not self-identifying, maybe he's had the surgery, maybe he's had the hormones, maybe he's had his driver's license altered, all of which can happen, of course. Is the police department going to report that statistic to the FBI as the perpetrator being male or the perpetrator being female? We literally don't know the answer to that question. So we are highly likely, I suspect, to see a skew in the percentage of violent crimes that are reported as being committed by women, when in fact these crimes are being committed by men who claim to have a female gender identity. So yes, I guess that's the answer to your question is yes, we are seeing this play out administratively and in the law.
There's a Facebook archive page, and it's just an archive. You can't comment on it. It's simply called This Never Happens. And there's hundreds and hundreds of entries of exactly what Kara is talking about, crimes that are committed by men that are reported as women. And there's a hashtag on Twitter about it. And we simply say, these are not our crimes, not our crimes.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So there is, I follow Twitter and I'm aware of this situation. I've been mapping the situation, and there are different kind of camps and different kind of like arguments or focal points where people get like they dogpile on. One question that I want to ask you too is, how do you reach women who are on the other side of this issue? And why is it important for them to flirt with the turf mantle, if you will, or kind of look at how this stuff is actually billed as one thing and has an actual impact on their daughters, their mothers, and their own lives?
It's such a hard question. Amy probably has a lot more experience on, so I know Amy has a lot more experience on Twitter than I do because I'm fairly new to Twitter. For a while, I would spend time arguing with random strangers on the internet, specifically Facebook. And one of the most frustrating aspects of that is arguing with women who do need to be reached and who on social media seem to me to be unreachable. But I don't know. Amy, do you have a different experience of that?
You know, I feel like I've spent the last 3 years trying to say more and more clearly and specifically that men are men and women are women. And I've been angry when I've said it, and I've been gentle when I've said it, and I've tried a lot of different tactics. But yeah, those women are hard to reach. But I think that, as much as I can, I do try to frame it about consent and bodily integrity for women. And, I know for a fact that, I have friends who I've lost friends over this issue. Some of the friends that I've lost, I know have been raped or assaulted or have given birth and are mothers. And, I really try to gently hone in on that issue with them because, I know that they're kind people. So I know that because I know they're kind people, I know they're coming at it, again, under that progressive umbrella of inclusivity. But they are forgetting about that right to say no, the right to say no to men and boys, however they quote unquote identify. And I also really try to hone in on the fact that, I was a theater educator. That's the largest part of my career. I did that for 20 years. And my work was play creation. I worked with kids creating stories in their own voices. So the plays that I put on with these kids were stories that they created. So I have a real passion for kids telling their own stories in their own voices. And I really always, I was raised fundamentalist Christian. So I've always had a lot of pushback on gender roles. I was raised with really strict gender roles. I was told that men are natural leaders and women are naturally submissive to men. So when I worked with these kids, I said, clothes are just fabric. Fabric is gender neutral. Makeup is just face paint. Face paint is gender neutral. Express yourself however you feel. Express your own personal uniqueness. I have a real heart for all kids who are non-conforming. However, boys who are non-conforming, of course, the same can be said about girls, but a non-conforming boy who is dysphoric, discomfortable, uncomfortable with his male body, is feeling dissociated from his male body, that is a uniquely male experience. It's specifically male. Everything that he's experiencing is a uniquely male experience. You cannot experience that dysphoria with your male body unless you are male. So that experience is actually a uniquely male experience, and it is unrelated to existing in a female body. The two are entirely unrelated. So that boy, while I have great compassion for his distress, his discomfort, his confusion, his desires, it really is entirely unrelated from growing up in a female body. Because, I think that, again, this goes back to the sloganeering. One of the phrases, and I recently wrote about this on my Facebook, one of the phrases that we have a tendency to hear is that these boys just feel like a girl. Now, the only feelings that pertain to life in a female body are the functions and sensations of that body. All other, quote, feelings are emotions, and emotions are available to all humans. Every human can express, has the freedom to express the full range of emotions. So those boys absolutely have freedom to express whatever emotions they want to express, but it is unrelated to the functions and sensations of the female body. And I always try to bring that embodiment aspect in. I also have a background in phenomenology, so I like to keep things. Yeah. I like to keep things situated in the present. But we are always situated in our body. There is no disembodied place. There is no where these boys can go to access those functions and sensations, because they literally do not have the apparatus.
I think Amy makes a really good point about bodily autonomy, and it reminded me of something that Kelly J. Key Minchell said recently, which is getting back to Benjamin's question about how do we reach these women. We can use language around bodily autonomy. We can use language around consent. These are women. The women that you're talking about, Benjamin, are women who would absolutely stand up for the rights of women to report a sexual assault, to demand consent, and to demand bodily autonomy when it comes to other kinds of political issues that we probably don't want to get into too much right now. Something that I've been thinking about a lot is that in the course of normal discourse, if I'm reading a newspaper piece in the New York Times about the Me Too movement, and it talks about, if I read a piece that talks about 4 women, right? It'll say 4 women have accused Marilyn Manson of sexual abuse. 4 women, right? This will be the language that's used. Literally no one is jumping up and down and screaming, you have to call them cis women. Nobody is confused. At the end of the day, nobody is really confused by what the New York Times means when it says or reports 4 women have accused Marilyn Manson of sexual assault. And it's not just sexual assault. It's not just Me Too. You can read any article about how COVID, the disproportionate impact of COVID, how it affects men and women differently. No one's confused about that. You can read, I read a story about pregnancy, and it was talking about the impact of COVID on pregnant women. No one's confused. All of a sudden, when we're talking about so-called gender identity, everyone loses their minds.
Really quickly, Twitter played kind of backed up the trans movement in the wake of the Biden executive order. And because there was a Twitter hashtag, there's a bunch of drama, and they suppressed it. They started editorializing what this hashtag Biden erases women means and what TERF means. They played games. They editorialized. The next day, they pushed all that aside and said, Biden's going to help you with Roe v. Wade. Right. So they played the switcheroo and like, oh, well, look, he's going to protect your body from this thing over here, this abortion thing. And just forget about the gender identity in the corner.
Yeah, I immediately made a tweet about that. You cannot say that you are pro-choice and believe that girls don't have a choice to who's in their locker room and changing room and bathrooms. You can't say you're pro-choice and believe that a woman doesn't have the right to choose her healthcare provider and who that is. You can't say you're pro-choice and push boys into girls' sports. I mean, I think pro-choice is
a lesbian, or that a lesbian doesn't have a choice to choose to be only with women.
Yeah.
So we can, there's a lot to talk about, and I've spent years talking about it. You guys have spent years talking about it. And one thing that I was thinking about, like, well, are we reducing women to their biological functions? Are we being essentialist? We can do that whole thing. But what really matters now is getting out the word that this EO is bad business, and it does affect men too. That hasn't been spoken about in this particular issue, but I will try to get some men on that can talk about how this does negatively impact young boys and men. But what are you guys planning to bring awareness to this, and what are you hoping to accomplish?
We talked earlier about the first part of the EO, which is the policy that it laid out. The second part of the EO is the actions that agencies are now required to take. And so this is where the rubber really meets the road. The agencies are required to take essentially 4 actions, which all boil down to looking at every single policy that every agency has in place that protects sex. It then is required to look into ways that the policy can be altered so that sex will be defined to include gender identity. And the final step that agencies are required to do is 100 days from the issuance of the order. We said earlier that the order itself does not amend existing law. Agencies are required within 100 days of the date of the order, which was, a Friday ago, produce a plan as to what each agency is going to do. What that means is that we have now just under 100 days to talk with federal agencies, to explain what is going on, to urge agency heads, and underneath the agency heads, the people who will actually be required to do this work. We have an opportunity now to really, really engage. And so one of the things that the Women's Human Rights Campaign plans to do is to do exactly that. We're going to do as much advocacy as we possibly can, talking with government officials to explain to them exactly what we've been talking about for the past hour, what the impacts of this policy are on women and girls. And everyone can do that. We're doing it at the Women's Human Rights Campaign. And, we would just urge everyone to do it, because you're right, this is going to affect men and boys as well. And, I'm just going to do another shameful plug. Please go to womensdeclaration.com, sign the declaration if you feel like you're in agreement with it. And then if you're in the U.S., which probably most of your viewers are, please fill out the Women's Human Rights Campaign U.S. chapter's volunteer form. If you want to be involved but don't know exactly what to do, fill out our volunteer form. Someone will contact you. You can get plugged in. We'll have lots of ideas for actions that all of us can take in the coming weeks and months. And I think Amy is going to talk. Go ahead. Sorry.
I will have links to those in the description, just letting the audience know.
On March 8th, which is International Women's Day, we are planning an event called Women Picket DC. We were really inspired by our 4 sisters, the suffragettes, and there's a really great quote by Susan B. Anthony that just says, "No self-respecting woman should wish for or work for a party that ignores her sex." And that's pretty much what's happening right now, is our sex is literally being ignored. So we really want want to stand up as women, as a group in front of the White House and show Biden that no, we do not agree. We do not consent to this. We do not agree. Women reject this. So we right now have endorsements and partnerships with the WHRC USA. We have a partnership with Partners for Ethical Care, also Save Women's Sports, and also the Ride, a Women's Rebellion, which is an event, another event that is happening after our event. And we're gathering a group of women, have been calling on us asking, what can we do? Where can we put our energy? It's, in the gender critical and radical feminist community and women in general community, women are really frustrated and they want an outlet to speak their voice. And that's what we really hope to provide with this event, is to give women an opportunity to, use their voice and to, stand up and say, no, we don't agree.
Yeah, and we should also say we're going to do our absolute best to make this a safe event. Meaning, we're gonna comply. DC has in place some COVID-related protocols that we're going to absolutely comply with. Some women don't feel comfortable traveling because of COVID. That is totally understandable. You can also, if you can't come, you can donate to the effort. There's a donation page, yep. And this is going to be a peaceful event. This is we are absolutely committed to being peaceful.
Yeah.
I can't see you guys being violent. If you were violent, what would you do? Not saying that you would. Would you like smash a window, throw a coffee cup?
Like a primal scream.
Oh,
like
y'all.
Some sort of yeah.
And so that's happening on March 8th, and I'm sure the mainstream media will be all over it. It will be totally blasted here, there, and everywhere. Are you guys doing, is there infrastructure in place for local events too, like happened 4 years ago?
I believe so. I mean, I've been mostly focused on the EO and on getting the Equality for All Act introduced before Congress. Amy has just done amazing work, and I should say a handful of other women that we're working with, amazing work getting this thing up and going. And I have heard chatter about other women organizing locally. Amy, have you also?
Yes, absolutely. Right now we are working on collecting delegates from all over. So we're hoping to get delegates from all states. And I realize I forgot one of our partners, and I want to get the name correct. Oh,
you guys got more sponsors than a NASCAR.
I know we're gonna have like NASCAR jerseys on, I think. So empowering, Stand Up International. Thank you. I can't believe I almost forgot that. Stand Up International is also working with us, and Stephanie Gifford, who is CEO of that organization, is really helping us pull in delegates from each state. So the women who, again, are unable to attend or are feeling uncomfortable about attendance can absolutely have events in their own state. We also have a number of women who are international, who are supporting us, who have generously donated scholarships to send American women in their place. So we have just a bunch of support. It's been, we've only been at this for a week, and it's already been very overwhelming to see.
And so all the resources for the specific march, where will those be found on the internet? What website will they be found at?
Womenpicketdc.org is our main landing page. And currently we have Facebook and Twitter accounts under those same names, Women Picket DC. And we also have, from our landing website, you can find funding pages as well. We have a Give Butter campaign going also.
Excellent. And Kara, I have a worse memory than the average YouTube viewer. So could you repeat what's going up in front of the Congress and how people can be involved in that?
So the Women's Human Rights Campaign is promoting a bill called the Equality for All Act, and it would protect women and girls on the basis of sex, gay, lesbian, and bisexual people on the basis of sexual orientation, and anyone who does not conform to sex-based stereotypes. It's called the Equality for All Act, and you can find it by Googling it, and you can also just go to womensdeclaration.com. That is a bill that we are really, really hoping to get introduced in Congress this session because, as many of your viewers probably know, there's a bill that is currently called the Equality Act, which would replace or define sex to mean gender identity for many purposes. It passed in the House of Representatives last year. My understanding is that in order to go forward, it needs to be reintroduced in both houses this year, and that it has not yet, but we expect it to be. And we think that our bill is much better, much stronger, more protective of women and girls, more protective on the basis of sexual orientation, and genuine nonconformity with sex-based stereotypes.
And can people participate in getting that heard? Is there a way for them to write somebody, or is this all internal machinations of Congress kind of stuff? Where
a combination
sausage.
of both. It's a combination of both. Anyone can write to their representatives in Congress and to their senators and just share it, say like, you can just share it in an email or you can ask for a meeting. A lot of times people don't understand that members of Congress are unlikely to meet with us personally. However, members of Congress will send staff and they will be responsive to constituents and they'll schedule virtual meetings and they'll hold them, and it's an opportunity to sit down. They'll usually give you about a half an hour. Legislative staffers are usually not experts in this or in anything. And I say that not to denigrate them. It's to say that they have to do a lot of things, right? They have to cover a lot of territory. And so they're not going to be experts in this. And it's really a great educational opportunity. So please, everyone contact your members of Congress and your senators. You can do it easily online. It's really easy. You can just Google, find my House representative, find my senator. It comes right up and you can do a little search. You can find the person. They mostly have contact pages where you can just enter your information. They usually want your zip code so that they can confirm that you are a constituent. And most of the time they'll schedule the meeting.
So how are you guys feeling then? Is this are you hopeful? Are you in battle mode? Do you guys are you feeling down about things? Like what's just kind of your general feelings right now? Just to kind of be diffuse and human for our last few moments about this topic, about what's going on with this stuff.
Well, I think we're all really pumped about March 8th. I think we're all really, really excited. It has a ton of momentum. And I think we're all really excited to go forward with that. As Amy said, taking inspiration from the suffragists who were doing this 100 years ago. Same shit, different century. I hope it's okay to say that on your YouTube.
It's at the end. It's fine.
So, we don't really know what to expect. We don't know, for example, if the way that Biden did this by just coming out, I mentioned earlier, over the last several years, it's been by stealth. This was not stealth, right? He just came right on out. And maybe that will start to generate some curiosity amongst people who otherwise have just not been curious for the past several years. And maybe it will give us the momentum that we need to make real lasting legal change.
Yeah, I agree. I'm feeling very inspired. I mean, I think, there's definitely an underlying sense of anger. Mm-hmm. It's really, it's just appalling that this is being pushed by the president of the United States. So there's some underlying anger happening, but yeah, I personally am excited to have an opportunity, to have a place to put my energy. And I am really inspired by the women who are already getting involved. And I have had a lot of personal messages for women who have thus far, been silent, people from my community who are reaching out, who are saying, they haven't spoken to me about this before, but now they see, I do think there's a lot, because this is so public now, because it is not stealth, I do think a lot of women who were previously unsure are now really waking up about this and are taking it seriously.
Yeah, the way that this has been moving for the last few years was kind of under, there was this big dust storm in the White House. Trump was making so much noise and attracting and playing with so many emotions, and the media too. And this stuff was kind of just creeping along. It was bound to come out. This was bound to happen. It's happened in every other Anglo country. And I'm not saying anything special, and I guess Europe too. But if you look at what's happening in Britain and in Australia, there's some really insane stuff going on with there. So it is really a moment to be engaged civically.
Yeah, and if I could just add, I can understand why you have seen it explode in Anglophone countries, but I participate in a weekly webinar with Women's Human Rights Campaign with women all over the world. You might be astonished. It's creeping into the law in India, throughout South America. And, I listened to a woman from the Congo. She was asked to talk about some of the most pressing issues for women, and she said, rape in times of attack, right? And then she was asked to talk about gender identity and if it is even a thing, and she said, absolutely, it's a thing. So this is global.
Oh wow. It really, really, really impacts lower income people and societies. We tend to take a lot of our civilization for granted, a lot of our laws and stuff, but the impact on women, or the way that women are treated elsewhere in the world, this gender ideology is the last thing they need to gain stability.
Yeah.
Did I say Anglophobe? I meant Anglophone.
No, I thought you said Anglophone. Is that not what I said?
I don't want to be corrected on the internet, so I'd rather be correct myself on the internet.
I heard you say Anglophone, and I thought that's what I said back. But I hope
you said Anglophone, but actually, if you look at it, a lot of Anglo countries are really Anglophobic because of another cultural issue. That is, but we don't need to broach that here. Thank you guys so much for your time. Thank you, ladies, so much for your time. And this is some pretty exciting stuff. It's great to speak with you outside of the virtual world. And Kara, I met you. Amy, did we see each other in Seattle? I don't know, but that was almost a year ago.
I was still a little bit more shy in my turfing then.
It was a year ago yesterday, Benjamin. It was a year ago.
Was it the 20th or the 1st?
It was the 1st.
Oh wow, okay. I covered that. That was a pretty amazing event because I got footage from both events, so you really get to see two sides of the Seattle argument. I don't think that necessarily scales to the government level, but so great. I will get this out as soon as possible to stir up interest and involvement, engagement. I would ask that you guys send me the links, the relevant links, so we can place those down there.
Great.
Do you guys have any fortune cookies or witchy woman advice to give the audience as a farewell? Amy, do you knit? Because you're knitted out there.
I decided to go bright. That's my Twitter. My Twitter handle is bright. I don't knit. I'm always being offered a handcraft by my friends who have handcrafts, but it's too looking down tedious. I like speaking and writing.
Oh, excellent. Okay.
Can I answer your question about advice?
Yes.
Everybody has something to contribute. I have heard so many women say like, I don't have any skills. What am I going to do? I don't care. Everybody has something to contribute. We had someone contact us, a volunteer with Women's Human Rights Campaign, and she said, you know what? I know how to edit Wikipedia pages. Should I edit Wikipedia pages to be more favorable toward women and girls? We were like, yes, please do that. I don't know how to edit Wikipedia pages. There are women in this movement who are great at doing some amazing political art. Fabulous. I'm not going to do political art because I would be absolutely terrible at it. Everyone's got something to bring. Whatever it is that you're good at, show up and do that. There's a role for all of us to play in this movement.
Yeah.
Excellent. That's a good inclusive note to end on.